Well, hello. Welcome to my new studio here. Got got moved upstairs, but anyway, welcome to our Triple B online confirmation. Today, I want to tell you about Ruth. Ruth is a very important story. One is there's a lot that goes into the story of Ruth. You're going to find it in the Old Testament. You're going to find it right after Judges. So in the storyline of the people of Israel, that is where Ruth falls, right at the tail end of Judges. But it was not written then. You see, for the Israelites, there's two main events that really shaped who they are. The first one was Egypt. And we talked about that and their escape from Egypt with Moses and the Ten Commandments. And then with Joshua leading them into the Promised Land. The other event happened hundreds of years later, after King David, after Solomon, and we will talk about those guys in another session. But the kingdom of Israel kind of collapsed after Solomon. Because then when Solomon's kids took over, then it kind of became a divided kingdom, and there were other powers were rising in the area. Empires were starting to form. And so you had the Assyrians come in and they kind of wiped out the northern kingdom and what they did, which is what happened later too with the Babylonians, is the Assyrians, they would take over an area and they would take the leaders and they would take the people and they would move them to a different part of their kingdom and swap people to try to quell rebellions. That's why they did that. So the Assyrians did that to the northern kingdoms. In fact, out of the 12 tribes, there were only two left: Judah and Benjamin. And after a while, the Babylonians rose to power and they fought the Assyrians and they beat the Assyrians, and they kind of took over that whole area in the Middle East. The Babylonians are from like Iraq, and they went west, and I think they were stopped by the Egyptians. But so from Egypt, through Iraq and Iran, the Babylonians ruled that area. And for a while, they left the Israelites alone. They had, you had to pay money to the king of the Babylonians. But eventually he got wind that they were trying to start a rebellion and break free. So Nebuchadnezzar came and he just ran right over the top of Jerusalem and wiped the city out and destroyed the city and wrecked the buildings and the temple and everything that was there. And he took the leaders and all the rich people, the business owners. He left the farmers alone. He took all the city dwellers and those in power and moved them over to Babylon, resettled them. They were there for about 70 years. Then the Persians came to power and they beat the Babylonians and they were in charge, and they let the Israelites go back home. And so the two leaders that were leading the Israelites home were Ezra and Nehemiah. And you'll find those stories in the Old Testament because they led the people from Babylon back to Jerusalem, not knowing what they would find. And then they rebuilt the city and they rebuilt the temple, and they were resettling in that area, but they ran into a problem. And the problem was, who stayed loyal to God? Now, Ezra and Nehemiah said, we know that those of us who are in exile in Babylon, we know that we stayed loyal to God because we were there. But I don't know about you guys that stayed here, that were left behind. And even some of the people that were coming back, instead of just reclaiming their land, they were marrying into the families that were working that land. And so Ezra and Nehemiah said, you can't have any foreigners. So you got to divorce your wives. And those of you that were here, we don't know if you're still of pure blood or not. And so we're not going to count you as true Israelites. And it was a big controversy as who's in and who's out. And that's when the story of Ruth was written. Because in the story of Ruth, we have this woman named Ruth, who is not an Israelite. She is from the tribe of Moab. And the Israelites, well, basically they didn't get along with anyone. So they were fighting with the Moabs and the Moabites because they were already living in the promised land when Joshua came in. And Joshua didn't do his job by driving them out. And so God said they get to stay here. But they didn't like the Moabites. Moabites were just considered unworthy people. And Ruth was a Moabite. And so in the story of Ruth, we see where Naomi and her husband and her two boys, they leave Bethlehem because there's a famine. And they go over to where the Moabites are because crops were growing in that area. And they settled down there. And one of Naomi's sons married Ruth. Well, while they were there, Naomi's husband and the two boys, they all died. And Naomi didn't know what to do. But she heard that the famine was over. And so she thought, well, I'll go back to Bethlehem. Go back home. And she started to go back home, and Ruth and I forget the other lady's name, but they came and they were following Naomi, and Naomi says, why are you following me? You're both young, you're both widows. Go back home to your families where you can find another husband. And so the one did, but Ruth didn't. Ruth said to Naomi, no, I'm going to go with you. I'm going to make sure you're taken care of. And she said, I will go there, and your God will be my God, and your people will be my people. And so they go back over by Bethlehem. Well, the family accepted Naomi back, and Ruth with her. But being a widow, that meant that they had to rely on the goodwill of her brother-in-laws and maybe some cousins and uncles. And so they didn't have a lot. And being two women alone, they're kind of shunned. So one day it's harvest time. And one of the rules that God gave the people of Israel was that during harvest, leave some grain in the field. Whether it's on the edges or if it falls off the stalks while you're harvesting, leave it. Leave it for the poor, for the widowed, for the orphan. Leave it for the people who don't have anything so that they too can come and glean from the harvest, pick the little bit that's left behind and survive and live. So Ruth was doing that. And while she was doing that, she was doing it in the field of this guy named Boaz. And he came to check on his fields, and he sees this foreign woman. He sees her there picking up grain in his fields, and he asks his foreman, he says, "Who is that? Why is she here?" And they said, "Well, she is a Moabite, but she is with Naomi, and she's gleaning the harvest, picking up seeds for Naomi." Well, Boaz is related to Naomi. He's related to, he's a cousin of Naomi's dead husband. And so he goes up to Ruth and he sees her, that she's working really hard. And sometimes, when people come they give water to those who are working behind the harvesters, those who are picking up these leftover seeds, and they give them some water because that's dry, dusty work. You probably know better than me, working a wheat harvest and doing it by hand. But the foreman told Boaz that she's working harder than anyone. And so Boaz kind of took notice of her. And she came back and she gave, what she had picked up to Naomi so that they would have some food. And the next day she was back out again in the other next field that Boaz was harvesting. And he saw her again, and this time, he told his foreman to give her some extra grains. And Ruth saw that exchange. And she had a little conversation with Boaz. So this time when she went back to Naomi in the evening, she had all this extra grain, and Naomi asked what happened. And Ruth told her that the foreman named Boaz gave it to her. And Naomi had this little plot in her mind. He said, "Aha, I think Boaz kind of likes you. Pretty girl like you. I bet she's a little bit smitten." And so she tells Ruth to get dressed up and go to the threshing grounds where the men were threshing the wheat. And to go there and to bring some wine and some bread to Boaz and some other things, just to be nice to him. And so she did that. And eventually her and Boaz, we're going to start becoming a thing. And they had to follow some laws. And you can read about that in the story and what Boaz had to do to make sure that, he talked with his cousins. There's a line of people who's supposed to take care of Naomi. It's her husband's brother, and then it's other family members, and then Boaz was like third or fourth in line. Anyway, they would take care of Naomi because then they would get the land. But then, Boaz reminded them that they had this foreign woman there that was living with Naomi. And eventually, long story short, he ends up being called the person that would provide for Naomi. And him and Ruth get married. And they have a son. And they name him Obed. Now here's where the story is interesting and why it was written, to talk against Ezra and Nehemiah, saying that you had the only true Israelites were those that were born and raised in Israel for that time in Babylon, and then moved back to Israel. That God wasn't interested in the foreigners. God was only interested in the Israelites. And so they wanted to exclude people. Only these people can get in the circle and be part of our group. Well, that baby Obed grew up and married and had kids. One of his kids was Jesse. One of Jesse's kids was David, who eventually became King David, who eventually became, the most well-known and well-loved and a hero of the realm. And everybody looked to King David, and God promised King David that there would always be someone from his line, his descendants, on the throne of Israel. One of the names that we call Jesus is Son of David, because he's descended from David. So the writer of Ruth wanted people to know that our greatest hero, our greatest king, David, was descended from a Moabite, from an outsider, that his great-grandmother was an outsider. And the writers of the Gospels also write in their genealogy. You'll see Ruth's name to remind us that the Son of God, the Son of David, the Messiah, the anointed one of Israel, is not, descended from this outsider, from this foreigner. The story of Ruth reminds us that every time we try to put a wall up or to make a circle and say only these people are the people that God loves and those people God doesn't love, the story of Ruth reminds us that we haven't made that circle big enough, because everyone outside of it are people that God loves, that people that are important to the story of God, in the story of God, in God's relationship with Israel, but also God's relationship with us. That is Ruth. It's a short 4 chapters. It's a short read. I encourage you to read it. But that is Ruth in a nutshell. Thank you for joining me for this online session, and hopefully next week we can meet again in person. Until then, have a blessed week.